So, Rhonda, if you could have any job in the court other than journalist, what would it be?
I think I would enjoy being the bailiff.
Nobody messes with the bailiff.
No one. You've never read a story about someone messing with the bailiff.
James, what would you do?
It would be nice to be the judge.
I would like to be the sketch artist, which comes with its own pressure, I have to say. You got to move fast, but I was a caricature artist at one point in my career. Wow. So I have some skill.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen.
Mother Teresa could not meet these charges. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial.
Welcome to the Trump Trials Sidebar. I'm your host, Libby Casey, and I'm here in Washington in our newsroom with Rhonda Colvin. James Hohmann is joining us by Zoom today. You can find us every Thursday on your favorite podcast app. We're also broadcasting on YouTube. So if you want to see our studio in its vivid color, just go to youtube.com/Washington Post and find us there. Well, we are back just 1 week after the felony conviction of Donald Trump. 34 counts of falsifying business records. He was convicted on every count by a New York jury of his peers. It was weeks of a trial, less than 2 days of deliberation, and Trump became the first former American president to also be a felon. On today's episode, the fallout. How are Americans responding, and what are Trump supporters and detractors saying? How might this also affect the 2024 presidential election? Looming over everything, we're also watching the Supreme Court. So we'll talk about the role of the justices in this moment. And of course, Trump has other cases pending here in Washington, in Florida, and in Georgia. So we'll take a pulse check on those. Let's start, though, with how the guilty verdict has aged over the past week. So, Rhonda, the ink, or maybe the pencil, was barely dry on the jurors' forms, and Trump was already speaking to the public, the press, and his supporters, and frankly lying about what happened and how it happened. How was Trump trying to spin this?
Well, it was a very familiar speech he gave at Trump Tower. It was actually the same spot where he declared his candidacy back in 2015. If people remember him coming down the so-called golden escalator and giving his speech there, it was the same spot. And some of the themes were very similar to what he talked about back then. He, right off the bat, started talking about immigration. He started talking about, there was even a point where he talked about Democrats will stop you from getting cars. It seemed to ramble a lot. So it almost felt like it was a part campaign speech and then a part response to the verdict. He talked about the judge, saying the judge is corrupt. So there were certainly themes we have heard from him before. I think also what was notable is he didn't have a crowd. It was supposed to be a press briefing or a press conference, but he didn't take any questions. But he did not seem like the Trump you see at rallies. Of course, this was less than 24 hours since this major verdict, so you were able to see sort of what the early Trump response was, but it was very similar to how he has categorized this entire trial, saying it was rigged, all of those familiar themes.
James?
Not surprised that he kind of went that route. He's back on the campaign trail. As we record this, he's in the air flying to Phoenix. He's back fully in campaign mode and trying to use this to his advantage as anyone dealt this hand would. And I think, they've probably played the conviction hand politically as well as they could in terms of record fundraising, firing up their base, creating the sense of martyrdom and victimhood. Trump started at Trump Tower, and he's really just continued to make that case the last week.
Tell us more about the fundraising, James, and also how have Democrats fared in the wake of this in terms of rallying Biden supporters, or people concerned about another Trump presidency?
Everyone sort of went to their corners. There's a couple things. There have been several snap polls now that a bunch of different networks and news organizations have done. They've showed some marginal movement. Interestingly, not as much movement as, a year ago when you were doing polls saying, if Trump was convicted, would you still vote for him? The majority of Americans in every poll approve of the guilty verdict. They think Trump committed the crimes he was convicted of. And those numbers are true in the swing states. I think that the argument for Democrats is there's all these other charges hanging over him. Do you really want to take a chance? Do you want the chaos to follow him? But I don't think that it's like the underlying charge necessarily as much as a sort of reminder of what a Trump presidency might represent. I do think it has helped rally Republicans behind Trump. Overwhelmingly, Republicans disapprove of the verdict, but it is not campaign shattering. It's still, I think, too early to say, but it didn't move the needle the same way. Honestly, the charges against Trump did a year ago in terms of getting Republicans to rally behind him. It hasn't had the same kind of tectonic effect on public opinion just yet.
So, Rhonda, how have members of Congress been responding?
If I could tack on just something James said about the polling, he's absolutely right about how it feels very static with both sides. Republicans are entrenched in supporting him. Democrats are entrenched on saying this conviction means he should not be running. But there was one interesting poll that came out from ABC Ipsos earlier this week and right after the verdict, and it polled the double haters, the people that we have classified as they don't like Biden, they don't like Trump, they're very unhappy with both choices. 65% of Americans who view both Trump and Biden unfavorably think the verdict was correct, with 67% believing Trump should end his presidential campaign. 67% of these double haters. And from what we have seen and what we're reporting right now from the campaign trail, these are the folks who will make a dent in the results in November. So that's a really important group to look at their sentiment on what happened in post-conviction.
Before we move on to the question about Congress, James, I'm wondering if you are a political maverick, let's say, which you kind of are actually. What are you watching? What are you concerned about on either side of the aisle? Like, where are you going to be watching for change and danger zones?
I talked to someone who did a focus group with 10 suburban women in Phoenix after the verdict came down. It was 10 women who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020. And they were still sort of, most people have regular lives. They're not following the ins and outs of this. They had sort of heard the news, but hadn't really internalized it yet. A lot of these people still sort of aren't paying attention to the election. They feel like it's a ways off. And they also, my source who was in the room watching this focus group said they didn't feel like it directly affected them. So I sort of wonder, at what point do those people start paying attention or engaging? Does it break through beyond the headline with really honestly shockingly small number of voters in like 5 states who are actually going to determine this election?
So, Rhonda, turning to Congress, there is this fascinating thing that's happening where instead of sort of trying to move on past it, some Republicans are trying to light it on fire, right? Using it to really try to motivate people and tick them off.
Yeah.
How are they reacting and what are they doing?
Yeah, they're definitely reacting, but in ways that we would expect, right? Because many of them were there in the last weeks of this trial, supporting him, putting on a press conference. The Speaker of the House was there. But more specifically, what I've seen from members of Congress, specifically House Republicans, they are taking this and they're running with it. They, in fact, the Speaker of the House unveiled a plan that he said will be a 3-pronged approach at undoing the weaponization, the so-called weaponization of the judicial system. One of those approaches that actually started up this week is trying to use the appropriations process in Congress, which pays all the federal bills and the federal agencies, to use that to freeze funds out from the DOJ because they feel that, that's one way to stop some of the investigations into Trump. A lot of this is just messaging. I don't know if it'll go far. It'll probably gum up some of the negotiations when it comes to funding the government. That bill will be due in late September. But we have seen them react pretty forcefully and stand with Trump and say that they're going to do everything they can from the legislative branch to help him out on this.
James, some of this I track back to Brett Kavanaugh. Now, stay with me for a minute, but there's this real outrage reaction that seems to be effective, right? And when Brett Kavanaugh was accused sexual misconduct back when he was like a teenager. And he's there going before the Judiciary Committee and the Senate trying to sort of justify his nomination to be a Supreme Court justice. And at first there's this retreat, and then there's this forceful, like yelling, screaming, just pushback. And it seems like Republicans have found that, for whatever reason, in whatever way, that is working for them, and they are just continuing to use that harshness. We're going to talk about the irony of this weaponization question in just a little while, because someone else who's going through his own legal problems right now is President Joe Biden's own son. So it's a bit rich for Republicans to say this is being weaponized against Donald Trump when, Biden, and there's a Senate Democrat who's on trial right now. Joe Biden's own son is on trial right now.
This is absolutely a turning point. You compare Kavanaugh to Roy Moore. Kavanaugh is in 2018, Roy Moore is in 2017, and the Roy Moore case was really the last gasp of, you had Richard Shelby, the then senator from Alabama, saying he couldn't vote for Roy Moore, and people being really horrified by the accusations, very credible accusations of misconduct. And then a year later, kind of rallying around the flag with Kavanaugh. And I do think that part of what we're seeing is that this is Donald Trump's Republican Party. He has fully consolidated control in the party. One of the things I was most struck by coming out of the verdict last week was how few people were critical of Trump.
How few Republicans, right.
How few Republicans. Like Susan Collins actually put out sort of a pro-Trump statement. Larry Hogan, the Republican Senate candidate in Maryland, a state that's as blue as West Virginia is red, he said you have to respect the verdict. And then you had Laura Trump, the president's daughter-in-law and co-chair of the RNC, going on TV saying he shouldn't have said that, and basically threatening to cut off his campaign from getting national help. Chris LaCivita, one of Trump's advisors, said, we're not going to spend any, the National Party's not going to do anything to help you. And I think that was all about sending a message. Like, you have to stay in line, you have to rally behind Trump or else. And it really is striking. The chairman of the College Republican National Committee said, this is a country where we believe in the rule of law. I don't think Trump should have been prosecuted, but you have to respect the jury's verdict. And you had all these prominent Republicans saying, this woman who's running the College Republicans needs to be ousted because of the apostasy. I just think that that's the enforcement of discipline and the kind of the cult of personality that the GOP has become.
I want to play something that Speaker Mike Johnson said on Fox News. He's talking about the Supreme Court, and he's setting one would think a very unrealistic expectation, Rhonda, of what he expects the Supreme Court to do. Let's listen to this clip, and then we can talk about it afterwards.
People have to believe that justice is fair, that there's equal justice under law. They don't see that right now. And I think that the justices on the court, I know many of them personally, I think they're deeply concerned about that as we are. So I think they'll set this straight. They want to try to bankrupt Donald Trump. They want to diminish his credibility and go after his character. They wanted to keep him off the campaign trail, which they were successful in doing for many weeks. And now they want to call him the convicted felon. This will be overturned, guys. There's no question about it.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. We have to just say first and foremost that this was not a prosecution run by Joe Biden or the Biden administration. And there were a lot of checks and processes that the judge went through. And this was a jury of New Yorkers who was chosen, and Trump's lawyers had a role in the process. He had every right to have his role served as a defendant. So I have to just put that out there because I feel like we can't start with a false premise of like justice wasn't served. Okay, moving on from there, Rhonda, what kind of an expectation is Johnson setting up for the Supreme Court to act?
Well, I almost think that's more for the viewers who tuned into that. And I don't know if the reporters or the anchors who were interviewing him asked what he meant by overturn, but I believe the Speaker of the House would know that the Supreme Court can't overturn this verdict. Or can't help in a case that is sovereign to a locality, New York City. So this was a local case, essentially. The federal government doesn't have any influence into it. However, we've seen this from Republicans before throughout this entire year that they have wanted to investigate Alvin Bragg. They've actually written a letter, the House Judiciary Committee, and they want to see if he can come in and do a testimony. We'll find out actually on Friday, tomorrow, if he will agree to that testimony. But there has been this really vigorous effort to perhaps message to Republican voters to think that the legislative branch, the Supreme Court, can do something about these charges, and that there isn't really anything that they can do. So I'm just a little confused at what he meant by overturn. Again, I don't know what happened after that clip and if maybe the anchors followed up with him, but that's not how things work. And I will also add that Merrick Garland was on the Hill this week in front of a Hill committee. It was a usual cabinet official, check-in. That's how these things start. But of course, given the timing, a lot of Republicans used the moment to go after Merrick Garland on charges against Trump. There was one point where Matt Gaetz went after Merrick Garland and told him, accused him of playing a role in the New York case. And it almost appeared as if Garland was a little confused. Like he said, we didn't have anything to do with this case. So again, there are separations of powers in this country. At least there should be. That's what the Constitution has. So again, a lot of this is messaging to the base.
Yeah, James, what was your 2 cents on this?
Oh, there technically is like a very narrow path to appeal. So the way federalism is obviously central to our system. And I think Mike Johnson was being disingenuous. This is just like before January 6th, Trump saying, well, if Mike Pence does the right thing, then I'll be fine. This is the kind of Trump world saying, if the Supreme Court does the right thing, I'll be fine. The way the appeals process works, it's a little confusing because New York uses different nomenclature, but after sentencing, which we'll talk about, Trump will have 30 days to file a notice of appeal. Then it goes from the Supreme Court, which is the trial court, as confusing as that is, to the appellate division. And then if Trump loses there, he can appeal again to the Court of Appeals, which is essentially their state level Supreme Court. And this could take years. These are very long, drawn out processes. If Trump loses at the highest court in New York on a matter of law, like on some kind of technicality, it wouldn't be like challenging the facts or the findings of the jury. Theoretically, there would be a way to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the thing about appeals is not only do they take a long time, they usually fail. And this is just not, it's not a serious thing to say. It also is sort of the pot calling the kettle black. It's sort of like, well, the justice system is being weaponized against us. We're going to get our friends on the U.S. Supreme Court to do the right thing and to save Trump. And Trump obviously nominated 3 of the 9 justices, but it does send this message that is very at odds with their claims. That the court, they're basically saying they want the courts to be political for them.
Yeah, and this is after John Roberts and others have tried to sort of have this like we're not all buddies, like, right? We're an independent branch, and then they go and say this, and it sort of really blurs the lines and makes everybody wonder. It's ironic they're asking for impartiality and rule of law, and they're also saying, and like, I'm paraphrasing here, but come on, good buddies, like, do us a solid, right? Do us a solid. Yeah. I want to just pivot a little bit to an undercurrent that's happening here, which is that Joe Biden's son is on trial right now in Delaware. This is moving a lot faster than Donald Trump's trial. Jury selection just took a day. They're moving forward. We will probably have a verdict, I would say, next week, James. Is that fair to say?
Probably, yeah.
And I in no way want to make any sort of equivocation between what Donald Trump was convicted of and what Joe Biden's son is accused of doing. But Trump and his team are trying to weaponize that and go after Hunter Biden, the president's son, and sort of muddy the waters and cast a lot of suspicion on the Bidens because of it. So I want to just dig into the facts of the case so we can clear up any misconceptions and then talk about how it's being politicized. So James, take us through what Hunter Biden is on trial for and what the parameters of that are.
Yeah, so Hunter faces 2 separate criminal trials by the feds. The first, which is what this one is about, is that he bought a revolver in 2018 and he signed a form, which anyone who buys a gun does, that where it asks you to check a box, and it says, "Are you using illegal drugs? Are you you abusing illegal drugs?" And he checked the box saying no, and it's honestly it's a pretty clear-cut, open and shut case. Like, Hunter definitely was using drugs. He definitely bought this gun, and the prosecution is basically laying out all the evidence, including playing for the jury a clip of Hunter reading from his own audiobook about how he was using drugs at the time. And then they're having Hunter Biden's ex-wife and Hunter Biden's then girlfriend, who was the widow of his dead brother, basically testifying that he was using drugs and that he had bought this gun. And it was actually Hallie Biden, Beau's widow, who threw the gun in a dumpster because she was concerned about him having the gun. So it's salacious, but it's a pretty narrow, specific charge. And then in a few months, closer to the election, Hunter Biden will be on trial in California for not paying his taxes for a couple years.
So, Rhonda, congressional Republicans are really like trying to create this whole swirl around Hunter Biden, Joe Biden. Talk to us about what is actually happening in the courts right now versus everything they're trying to throw and get attention for on the Hill.
Yeah, as James just outlined, the current trial on Hunter Biden involves that gun charge. However, congressional Republicans in the House have, especially the committees that are over the impeachment inquiry into the Biden family, they have referred criminal charges to the DOJ through a letter that they wrote this week, saying that Hunter Biden, as well as James Biden, the president's brother, lied to them during closed-door depositions they gave as a part of this impeachment inquiry that the House voted on and have been going through for the last several months. There hasn't really been a smoking gun with this inquiry, but by having a criminal referral letter to the DOJ, that sort of, shows their supporters, their voters, that they've been working on this inquiry. Again, what they are referring to the DOJ and saying that Hunter Biden did or lied about, that's different from the charges he's facing in this gun charge situation. But the timing is really everything. And they're trying to kind of lump it all together.
And also do it on the coattails of Trump's conviction, right?
Right. It is sort of that whataboutism that we've seen from congressional Republicans, where if, Trump is being investigated on something, they will build an investigation on Biden. So that's a lot of the congressional politics that we've seen all year.
Hey, James, I've heard you say something interesting, though, that this might actually prove to be like the last gasp of Republicans' attempts to impeach Joe Biden. Explain that for me.
I think it's one of those things. It is a face-saving attempt. Rhonda's absolutely right. But basically, they're taking everything that they were able to get from all these depositions and this long fishing expedition, and now they're just putting it in a document and a referral and sending it to the Justice Department saying, hey, we think Hunter and Jimmy Biden lied to us about business dealings. You should charge them. And it's pretty thin rule. But what this means is that they're not moving ahead with their impeachment, that they don't have the votes among Republicans, that they don't think it would be politically advantageous in an election year. So one way to look at this referral, which they're saying, the Trump Justice Department next year could prosecute these guys, is that they're basically admitting that the impeachment inquiry didn't lead to what they wanted it to lead to. They're never going to say that. And James Comer and Jim Jordan are never going to come out and say we didn't get the goods. But this is as close as they're going to come.
So as all of this plays out, what's next on Donald Trump's calendar is a debate and then sentencing. So let's talk about sentencing briefly here and what's in store. We'll be talking more about that here on Sidebar as it gets closer. But it's important to point out that Trump's lawyers requested that July timeframe as the period for sentencing. They signed off on this. So it shouldn't be a shock to Trump that he's facing sentencing between a debate and the Republican National Convention. I want to play for you guys how the chair of the RNC is talking about this as though it's just like a very normal part of doing business. Let's watch. This is from Newsmax.
The convention happens next month, and your nominee could be sentenced to actual jail time 4 days before everything kicks off in Milwaukee. Have you planned for that at the RNC?
Yeah, we're working on that right now. I'm actually going up to Milwaukee this week, and we're going to have a series of conversations. But look, we expect that Donald Trump is going to be in Milwaukee, and he's going to be able to accept that nomination. And if not, we will make whatever contingency planning we need to make for it.
It's hilarious that he's saying, I'm going to Milwaukee, as if he's going to do something in Milwaukee to prep for his nominee being in jail. It is. I mean, it's funny because obviously, it's funny for a lot of reasons, and the nonchalance with which he says, of course. But it's also funny because, in 2020 we had virtual convention. Certainly the Democrats did. They were actually supposed to be in Milwaukee because of COVID. And then remember how much Trump attacked Biden for the basement campaign. And I don't think Trump's going to get jail time. But the idea of Trump campaigning virtually from home confinement or whatever, and speaking on the Jumbotron in Milwaukee is kind of a wild thing to think about. And clearly they are thinking about what do we do? It's a low probability worst case scenario for them if he can't be there in person. There's not going to be a balloon drop, wherever he is if he's not there. But it is that we're in uncharted waters. This is unprecedented.
Uncharted waters indeed. I just, as you mentioned, he states this all in a very matter-of-fact way. And just step back and think about the RNC or any, party having planning meetings about how they might have a contingency plan on if the nominee needs to be virtual because of criminal charges is really astounding. And I don't know. Well, to be fair, these things do take time, planning a convention, all of that. So yes, they are thinking of all sorts of contingency plans, but it's just really kind of mind blowing that this is where we are as a country at this point, where one party has to actually factor in, even if there are low odds, they have to factor in that their nominee may need to participate virtually because of jail time.
Something that Donald Trump, when we talk about sort of the weaponizing of the judiciary, Republicans are claiming it's been weaponized against them, but something that Donald Trump has done repeatedly is really threatened to weaponize the judiciary or government at all, across all branches, to weaponize it against his opponents. He's most notably said that this run for president is about being the retribution for his supporters. He said that, James. I mean, he has said, I am your retribution.
It's chilling. He's saying it out loud. He gives himself wiggle room. He's also said, I'm going to be too busy to be going after my opponents. But he is very much out there saying that that's his animating rationale for wanting another term in office.
Just last night, actually, so we're taping on Thursday, just last night on Wednesday, June 5th, he was on Fox News talking to Hannity about this question. Hannity asked him about retribution, and let's listen to how Donald Trump answered it.
Those that want people to believe that you want retribution, that you will use the system of justice to go after your political enemies.
So, number one, they're wrong. It has to stop, because otherwise we're not going to have a country. Look, when this election is over, based on what they've done, I would have every right to go after them.
Okay, so I'm hearing multiple things. I'm hearing, no, I wouldn't be retribution, even though he said it will be before. And then at the end, he's like, but I'd have a right to. So I'm confused.
What I was going to say right before we put into that clip was over the weekend when he did another Fox interview with Fox and Friends, he claimed he had never said lock her up about Hillary Clinton, when there are lots of tapes of him, responding to the crowd, yelling that in 2016. So, he is all over the place. He is very erratic. My takeaway, I'm eager to hear Rhonda's analysis, is that Sean Hannity was trying to get him to be no, I'm never going to do that. Don't worry. He's trying to get him to say, I'm going to be presidential. I'm going to be above that. And Trump, my read was he wouldn't say it.
Yeah, I would agree with James on that. He wouldn't say it. I just had to look it up, but I do remember we have it on record that Trump said, I am your justice, I am your retribution. He said that at CPAC. So he is on record saying these things, and the lock her up thing that James just pointed out. But one thing that I was thinking about when I heard that clip is, maybe don't focus too much on the words, focus on the actions, because we could go back to when I covered the first impeachment trial of then President Trump. And I remember covering his, the day after he was acquitted by the Senate, he had this meeting in the White House. It was sort of like a victory party. He had members of Congress there who he said helped him beat these charges and all of that. And then if you remember, weeks later, he fired, or the federal government fired the Vindman brothers, who, if you guys remember, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was one of the persons who testified against him in the impeachment hearings. And I remember White House aides said, this was a part of fleshing out the pipes. This was about cleaning up. And it was looked at as retribution, that they went against him, they went against the White House, they weren't loyal, and this is what happens. And those are just two examples. I'm sure if, we could all sit here and think of others that we've covered, but I mean, look at the actions. He has gone after the people who've gone after him before. That's no surprise, even if he's not saying it now.
You're listening to Sidebar from the Washington Post. In a moment, we'll talk about the Supreme Court and other cases to watch for. Stay with us. This is the Trump trials sidebar from the Washington Post. Rhonda, we were on jury watch for a couple of days, but now every Thursday we are on Supreme Court watch, because that's when the court is sitting and announcing their decisions in cases. They may add additional days onto the calendar as June ticks by, but we're watching for a huge immunity case that has big implications for Donald Trump and the presidency.
That's right. I think one of the biggest decisions we're waiting on is the case where they are considering if Donald Trump has immunity, specifically immunity from the case, the federal case that looks into his conduct on January 6th in ramped up a crowd that stormed the Capitol. So that case has been on ice. That's the Jack Smith case. It's been on ice until we get a decision from the Supreme Court. So that's the one that we're really waiting to see what happens there, for obviously the historical record and what that means for the presidency, but also if this January 6th case can move forward.
James, for all intents and purposes, the Supreme Court just taking this up has stalled things to the degree where things are really dead in the water. So just update us on where Jack Smith's January 6th case is. That's the one based in D.C., as well as the Florida case, as well as the Georgia case.
It really does increasingly feel like we're not going to have another actual trial before the election. In D.C., the proceedings are on pause until there's a Supreme Court decision, and the actual text matters a lot, because the Supreme Court is likely to say the president has some immunity and create the kind of a test, basically, that the lower courts are going to have to administer, and then that could get appealed and it could wind its way back. It's really, and the Supreme Court has sort of like moved at the last possible minute every time. They waited a couple weeks to take up the case. They scheduled oral arguments in the immunity proceeding for the final day of the hearings for the term. I would not be surprised at all if they don't put out their immunity decision until late June or even early first couple days of July. They really are stalling, essentially. In Georgia, there was big news this week because the appellate court they stopped proceedings in the cases against Trump and his alleged co-conspirators until the appeals court could hear whether Fani Willis should be disqualified. Judge Scott McAfee ruled that Fani Willis could continue to prosecute the case if her ex-boyfriend, Nathan Wade, removed himself from the case, which has happened. And now Trump and everyone else is appealing that and saying that Fani Willis needs to be taken off. And so anyway, it means that they're not even going to hear oral arguments until October. They're not going to make a decision until after the election. So that would mean that the case couldn't proceed. Trump can't pardon himself on that one.
So you took us through the Supreme Court, immunity, and then that impacts, as Rhonda said, the January 6th case, which would be tried in D.C. Then we popped into Georgia, and you've talked to us about how that's really on ice right now, and we're waiting for this next sort of turn of the wheel here to find out if that case can even move forward. And now you're pivoting us to the classified documents case, which is the federal case based in Florida. What's going on there?
Judge Eileen Cannon has also sort of dragged her feet and stalled quite a lot, hasn't ruled on a bunch of motions. She actually did on Wednesday give some structure to how she's going to go about ruling on some various motions and setting some dates for hearing arguments from Trump's lawyers and Jack Smith's lawyers. But they're fighting over, for example, they're going to have a hearing on whether it's even on a motion to say that Jack Smith's appointment as special counsel is unconstitutional. This is part of a strategy to delay, and they'll have the hearing. Judge Cannon will presumably rule that Jack Smith is legitimate and can proceed. Then there's just going to be a bunch of fights. So it's going to stretch for a long time. And Judge Cannon seems kind of perfectly happy and content to let this drag out until after the election, perhaps hoping that the case becomes moot if it goes past the election.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Georgia is, so we got the news that the appellate court says we're not taking this up until October. We got that news this week. We also got news yesterday that they will not let the case, any sort of pretrial work happen either. That's on ice. So that's sort of, it's now doubly on ice. Like McAfee, the judge in the Fulton County case, he did say that if the Trump side wants to appeal his decision to keep Fani Willis on, that they can, but the court will continue to work on the case. Well, now the appellate court says that they cannot. They put a stay on that. So I don't even know if it's conceivable, and of course we can maybe ask our great reporters who've been covering this case, is it even conceivable that that case could move forward even in the early months of the next year? So, and also what's interesting about Georgia is that was always looked at as one of the 4 cases that had so much evidence. It had the physical evidence of the phone call, where you actually see Donald Trump tied to this electors scheme. And we've seen in other states, there have been 5 states so far who have gone after the fake electors in their state, have gone after some of the architects of the fake electors scheme to overturn the election results in Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada. So the fact that this Georgia case is not moving forward is a pretty big deal. That
and also, sorry, Rhonda, to cut you off, but also no small thing that it would have been televised. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom in Georgia in that case, and so we would have all been able to see it and experience it with our own eyes and ears and judge for ourselves, or what Americans could judge for themselves, what they thought about the justice situation, the justice of it, as well as the case, as well as the defendant. So we'll be talking more in other episodes of Sidebar about just where these cases are, where they're going, and we'll check in with the reporters who, like Rhonda said, are kind of going in the micro level of what could happen next. James, I want to break one bit of news here that just happened before we started taping, and that's about Steve Bannon. And I just want you to throw out what's happened in his case, because we now know he will be reporting to jail. What's the significance and why?
So he has to report by July 1st. It's significant. Peter Navarro already is in prison for the same crime that they were both convicted of, which is refusing to testify before the January 6th special committee. They were held in contempt of Congress, prosecuted, convicted, and Bannon has been trying to drag things out with appeals. The judge saying, you don't have grounds for appeal. You need to start serving your sentence. But it politically, it will help Bannon and others create this narrative that's inaccurate, that the Biden Justice Department is coming after them. And, it is, I think, meaningful accountability. A lot of people who didn't want to testify before the January 6th committee did, sort of kicking and screaming or taking the fifth, like Michael Flynn. And these guys just thumbed their nose, and now they're being held to account for it.
Well, that wraps up this episode of the Trump Trials Sidebar. Thanks so much, as always, to Rhonda and to James. A reminder that you can find us on YouTube. It's youtube.com/Washington Post. And of course, we are on your favorite podcast apps as one of the Washington Post's podcasts. Please do subscribe and read the Trump Trials newsletter. It is still so full of information and reporting. We may be through the New York trial, but there's a lot of other relevant reporting that's unfolding weekly, day by day. And Devlin and Perry are there breaking it all down for us. So check that out. We'll be broadcasting live when the sentencing of Donald Trump does happen. Right now it's slated for July 11th, but of course, stay tuned. And we'll also be covering breaking news on all other fronts, the Republican National Convention, the Democratic National Convention, a big news summer for us as it gets rolling. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.